I'm Amy, Green with Amy, and we're here with Brenda Davis, registered dietitian.
About our meat, fish, and milk nutritional necessities. And my guess is a lot of people probably said, well, we know the answer to that, so what do I need to come to that lecture for? But in fact, there's some really interesting discussions that we can have around this. So first of all, science very clearly says, no, they're not nutritional necessities. And the evidence is pretty strong. And the pun was very much intended here. Every single one of these guys is 100% plant-based, and this is 100% plant-based muscle. And I just wanted to give you a little overview of some of the most amazing vegetarian, vegan athletes that I know of. Because I think it's powerful when you see people at the very top of their game on a 100% plant-based diet, it tells you something. This is Scott Jurek. He is an ultra-marathon world champion. He set the Appalachian Trail record, running nearly 80 kilometers a day over 46 days. He also holds, this one just shocked me, the US record for the 24-hour run. He did 6.5 marathons in 24 hours. It's crazy. He's been 100% plant-based since 1999. Julia Hubbard, world champion bodybuilder, holder of 3 world titles, 3 Olympia titles, 2 Universe titles. And she's also the British Masters 60 and 200 meter sprint champion. She's been 100% plant-based since 2015 and vegetarian since 1990. This is Patrick Babomian, world champion strongman, holds the world record for log lift. He was considered Germany's strongest man. And Patrick Babomian has been 100% plant-based since 2011. This is Tia Blanco. She's a world champion surfer, holds the 2015-2016 Women's World Surfing Championship titles. She's been 100% plant-based since 2013 and vegetarian from birth. This is David Carter. He's known as the 300-pound vegan. He's an NFL football defensive lineman and a 6'6" guy. And actually, he and I were once in one of those Iron Chef competitions together. He was a good helper. Really nice guy. 100% plant-based since 2014. And of course, I don't even have to say who these women are. But of course, you know the Williams sisters, and they've won Wimbledon 7 times for Serena and 5 times for Venus. They've been 100% plant-based since 2012. This is Matt Danzig. He is the winner of the Ultimate Fighter Championship. I think he won something like 6 times. 100% plant-based since 2004. And this is my very dear friend, Sonia Looney. She's from Kelowna as well, or not from Kelowna, lives in Kelowna at the moment. She's a world champion mountain biker, 4 times US national champion, first woman to finish a 10-day race across Annapurna in Nepal. And she actually just finished a 24-hour, winning another 24-hour race where you go nonstop for 24 hours. She's amazing. She's been 100% plant-based since 2014. And to me, this is proof positive. If some of the strongest, fastest, longest lived people on the planet do so on a plant-based diet, it's probably a reasonable thing to assume it's safe and adequate for the rest of us. And yesterday I shared this with you, and I'll share it again for those of you that weren't here. This is the official position statement on vegetarian nutrition from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. this here. And they basically state that well-planned vegetarian, including vegan diets are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. These diets are appropriate for all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy and lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, older adulthood, and for athletes. And this is the document that you can share with your physician. This is the document that you can give any health professional who questions the adequacy of plant-based diets. It's free online, and it's a very important summary of what we know about vegetarian and vegan diets in terms of safety, adequacy, and disease benefits. So what we're going to do today is really examine the evidence. So number one, we're going to talk about why meat and milk are viewed as essential for people. We're going to talk about what are the key nutrients in these foods and how can we get enough of them from plants. How much do we need? What are the actual intakes in plant-based diets? What are the richest plant sources? And what are the pros and cons? And we're going to focus on this a little bit more of plant versus animal sources of these nutrients. So number one, why are meat and milk viewed as essential for people? Well, it really has a lot to do with public health history. For many years, hunger and malnutrition were our #1 public health concerns. And government policies were directed towards the elimination of hunger and deficiency diseases because there was a lot of hunger and nutritional deficiencies. Nutrition education campaigns were all about these eat more messages. And of course, you all know that it became a kind of a meat and milk solution to these public health problems. And economic policies sought to maximize meat and milk production in order to reduce malnutrition. And governments started to subsidize farmers. They supported their marketing of their products. They put in price controls. All of these were set in place to help reduce nutritional deficiencies. And they figured it was a job pretty well done. Diseases of nutritional deficiencies diminished, and the interests of animal agriculture became very deeply entrenched in the economy. And I don't know if you remember back in 1990, the World Health Organization released Diet, Nutrition, and the Prevention of Chronic Disease. And in that document, this was a really important document, in that document, they warned governments about these alliances with the meat and dairy industries and how it was coming back to haunt us. That was back in 1990. It was quite interesting. And of course, it appeared as though the job of improving health through nutrition had been very effectively accomplished. And meat and milk acquired these really quite lofty health halos. Meat is associated with protein, muscles, and masculinity. Milk is associated with calcium and strong bones and teeth. But what ended up happening is the eat more message backfired. While nutritional deficiency diseases plummeted, the eat more message gave rise to another very significant malnutrition menace called overconsumption. And a lot of people, when you think about malnutrition, you think about one thing. You think about hunger, right? And there are in fact 3 types of malnutrition. So the one that we all think of, which is malnutrition or hunger. The second is what we know as micronutrient deficiencies. The leading cause of blindness in the world is due to what? vitamin A deficiency. That's the number one cause of blindness, so that's a micronutrient deficiency. But the third is overconsumption. And a lot of people don't recognize overconsumption as a form of malnutrition, which it is. Overconsumption, in fact, now exceeds undernutrition as the number one form of malnutrition globally. It's quite shocking. As a result, diseases of overconsumption are responsible for about 70% of the deaths on this planet. And what we know is people eating plant-based diets are afforded quite a lot of protection against diseases of overconsumption. They actually have the lowest rates of these diseases of any dietary pattern. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in upcoming lectures. So the lessons that we learned from all of this was it was not the lack of meat or the lack of cow's milk that was responsible for the malnutrition people were suffering. It was the lack of a variety of nutrient-dense foods. When all you eat is rice, malnutrition can result. And so what we needed to be focused on was providing a greater variety of healthy food, not more meat and milk. And what's interesting is today, national and international diet guidelines are beginning to reflect the knowledge that we now have about diet and disease. And in fact, if you look around at some of the guidelines provided by international organizations, like the World Health Organization, you'd be surprised what you'd find. For example, this is the World Health Organization's 12 steps to healthy eating. Step number 1 is to eat a nutritious diet based on a variety of foods originating mainly from plants rather than from animals. Cancer organizations. So this one, eat a healthy diet with an emphasis on plant foods. That's the American Cancer Society. The World Cancer Research Fund, eat mostly foods of plant origin. The American Institute of Cancer Research, choose mostly plant foods such as vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and cut sugary drinks. We're seeing this over and over again. Even the Dietary Guidelines for American Scientific Advisory Committee in 2015 recommended a dietary pattern that is higher in plant-based foods such as vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and lower in animal-based foods. They basically said it's more health-promoting and associated with less environmental impact than the current US diet. And of course, Canada's food guide. And so we're seeing huge steps by governments to promote more plant-based diets among their populations. So the second thing we want to look at is what are the key nutrients that come from meat, fish, and milk. And we're going to talk a little bit we talked a little bit about protein yesterday. We're going to continue that conversation. We're going to talk about iron and zinc, which are found mainly in meat, poultry, and fish in terms of the different categories here of animal foods we're talking about. And then EPA and DHA from fish. And then we'll talk a little bit more about calcium, and we will not, even though B12 is something we find in these animal foods, we're not going to address that today because we addressed it enough, I think, yesterday. So we want to talk about, can we get enough of these nutrients from plant foods? And we also want to talk about, how we're doing and why we might choose the plant sources over the animal sources and focus on that. So yesterday I showed this cartoon, and I'm going to do a very quick review here. But this little guy is saying to this big guy, no meat at all, are you sure you're getting enough protein? And of course the point being that the largest land mammals on the planet get most of get their protein completely from plants. So it's not a shock that people can too. We're a lot smaller. So how much protein do we need? Well, we need about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. A little bit more for infants and children and for athletes, possibly more for seniors, and possibly 10% or so more for people eating whole food plant-based diets, because we digest a little less of the protein because of the fiber that ends up taking some of that protein out. So what do we need? Well, probably about 50 to 60 grams for most people. If we add 10%, it's still about 50 to 60 grams or just slightly more. And for seniors, it may be 1 to 1.3 grams per kilogram body weight to reduce age-related muscle loss. How much do we get? Well, the Adventist Health Study 2 showed that we get about 71 grams for vegetarians and vegans, and about 75 for meat eaters. Not a huge difference. In Epic Oxford, a little bigger difference, but still around the 70 for vegetarians and vegans, and closer to just over 90 for the meat eaters. And where do we get the protein in plant-based diets? Well, you can see soybeans, tofu, veggie meats, about the same amount as animal products, lentils, and other legumes, just slightly less than that. We get a fair bit from grains and seeds, nuts, oats, and even vegetables also provide some. And so we're going to move right along. Plant-based eaters generally get plenty of protein unless they don't get enough calories, which isn't a problem for most of us, or they eat nutritionally inadequate diets that are low in protein, high-fat, high-sugar junk food diets, or poorly planned fruitarian diets. So, the most healthful choices for protein in the plant-based kingdom are legumes like beans, peas, lentils, and soybeans or tofu, tempeh. And I want to talk just a little bit about soy in this lecture because I think it's a topic that a lot of people have questions about. One of the things we hear, and I don't know if you've heard this, but many people are claiming we shouldn't eat legumes because they contain lectins. Have you heard that before? Yeah, and who's spouting this stuff? The plant paradox guy, right? And the paleo and the keto and so on and so forth. And so, do you think this is really an issue? No. Lectins are actually distributed throughout the food supply. They're in everything. Some lectins are actually really healthy, and some are really harmful, potentially. In fact, there's some lectins that they're using in Japan as treatment for cancer. So there's some really interesting things about lectins. But the thing that we need to know is large raw legumes contain the harmful kind of lectins. So especially red kidney beans. If you ate undercooked red kidney beans, you would get a kind of a food poisoning-like reaction where you would vomit for 5 hours and feel like you're going to die. So there was one study I saw reporting about raw kidney beans and causing, because of the hemagglutinins, the lectins in kidney beans are really potent. But the reality is we cook large legumes, and it takes probably about 20 minutes to completely destroy the lectins with cooking. How long do we cook legumes? An hour and a half. So it's just not the issue it's being made out to be, because we cook legumes. You do not want to sprout legumes and eat them raw, with the exception of lentils, peas, mung beans. These tiny little legumes don't tend to have the same type of lectins that the large beans do. So the large beans, if you see these mixes of sprouted beans that have a lot of large beans in them, they should be cooked before being eaten to be on the safe side. So, and beans, this is really important. Our most decisively linked to health benefits. And they are one of the only foods that are consumed as dietary staples in every single blue zone that we know of. Are you all familiar with the blue zones?
Yes.
So places in the world where people live the longest, healthiest lives, and that's the one thing that they all do is consume legumes. So I want to talk just a little bit about soy. Is soy actually something that is safe to eat? And in fact, it seems so. And I would say it seems so because 2 out of the 5 blue zones eat soy every day as a dietary staple. So one is the people from Loma Linda, California, and 2 are the people from Okinawa, Japan. And if you look at the Okinawan daily diet, they eat about 7+ servings of vegetables. They eat generous servings of purple fleshed sweet potatoes, smaller amounts of rice and grains. So purple sweet potatoes make up about 70% of their total caloric intakes. They eat fish. Now some people say, oh, well, they eat fish, so it's not a very plant-rich diet, but it really adds up to about less than ½ an ounce a day. So it's a really tiny amount of fish that is included in the diet, and they eat an average of 2 servings of soy a day. So anyone that says, and almost all of the negative press about soy on the internet can be traced back to the Weston A. Price Foundation, Mary Ineg, and Sally Fallon. They're extremely anti-vegetarian, so much so that they've actually stated that the only people that should not breastfeed are vegans, because our milk wouldn't be good enough. So they're very anti-vegetarian and they're very anti-soy. But one thing that you just think about this, if in fact this is a dietary staple, 2 servings a day consumed in 2 blue zones, how can it be a poison? If it were a poison, these probably wouldn't be the longest lived, healthiest people on the planet, right? So that's something to think about. The science on soy, we probably have more science on soy than just about any other food. But soy may protect against prostate cancer, breast cancer, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in later lectures. And the evidence with breast cancer, people used to, you've probably heard this, you shouldn't consume soy if you are at risk for breast cancer or you have breast cancer. Well, in 2012, the American Institute of Cancer Research made a public statement, a press release, saying that the evidence is absolutely overwhelming now, that not only do you not have to worry about eating soy if you have breast cancer, it's probably protective. Even if you're on tamoxifen, it's protective. Even if you have BRCA1 or you're a BRCA1 or BRCA2 carrier, there was a study in Korea that showed that BRCA1 and BRCA2 carriers, the people eating the most soy, like 4 or 5 servings a day, had, I think it was about a 65% risk reduction for breast cancer. The people eating the most meat had an almost 200% higher risk of breast cancer. Cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, and bone loss may all be positively affected by soy consumption. Soy may also help with menopause symptom relief at a small level, male pattern baldness, and prevention of wrinkles. So very interesting. And when it comes to soy, I think the key things are these. First of all, you want to be opting for organic because, there are a few reasons. One is if you want to avoid genetically modified soy, you need to choose organic, but also a lot of the pesticides sprayed on soy are quite hazardous, so organic would be what you'd want to go for. And the other reason is that when we extract protein from soy to make veggie meats, one of the chemicals that's often used is hexane. And hexane is a very powerful neurotoxin. We don't know if there is much left in the products made from this hexane extracted soy, but it's probably not worth taking the risk. So you can't extract soy protein using hexane and call it organic. So you're protected if it's organic. And then the next thing you want to do is choose less highly processed soy, like edamame, tofu, tempeh, miso, natto, fortified organic soy milk. And so those are choices that you can make. You want to limit your intake of the more highly processed choices, like veggie meats and soy cheeses. So are there advantages of plant versus animal protein? And the answer is absolutely, overwhelmingly yes. So legumes are the foods, and so comparing legumes with meat. Legumes are the highest fiber foods you can eat. Meat has no fiber. Legumes are extremely high in phytochemicals. Meat has none. Legumes are high in antioxidants. Meat has minimal antioxidants. Legumes are low in fat and saturated fat. Meat is high in fat and saturated fat. Legumes are cholesterol-free. Meat is high in cholesterol. Legumes contain a type of iron called non-heme iron. Meat contains a fair bit, about 40 to 45% heme iron, which is a pro-oxidant. I'll tell you more about that later. Legumes contain no added hormones or antibiotics. Meat has natural hormones and often has added hormones and antibiotics. Legumes don't have any of this pro-inflammatory molecule called Nu-5-GC, which is a sialic acid that's quite detrimental in terms of disease risk. Of course, meat is the most potent source of Nu-5-GC. Legumes, you can't produce TMAO when you eat legumes. You can produce a lot of TMAO when you eat meat. And TMAO is just trimethylamine N oxide, which is another very pro-inflammatory molecule. And you'll be hearing lots more about that during the conference. And legumes tend to be low in chemical contaminants. Meat tends to be high because it's higher on the food chain. And if you look at the research on legumes and mortality, it's pretty consistently favorable. I love this study. This was a study that looked at food intake patterns of people 70 plus years of age from a variety of cultures. The only statistically significant food indicator of longevity was legume intake. For every 20 grams of legumes consumed, there was a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality. Imagine. Do you know how much this is, 20 grams? It's like 2/3 of an ounce. It's a tablespoon and a half. Imagine if you ate a whole cup, you'd live forever. It's really quite shocking. So, and of course, as I mentioned, legumes are staples in every single blue zone. And this man here is actually an Okinawan centenarian, which means he's at least 100 years of age. He's my goal. This is what I want to look like when I get to be his age. And Walter Willett was actually asked, do you know who Walter Willett is? So Walter Willett is the head of epidemiology at Harvard School of Prevention or Public Health. Yes, thank you. And so he was asked how much meat is safe to eat. Based on all the evidence that you've seen, he's probably the most highly respected epidemiologist on the planet, written hundreds of articles. And this is what he said. If you step back and look at the data, the optimal amount of red meat you should eat should be 0. And here's why. Here are the meta-analyses we have on red meat and mortality. You can see, here's unprocessed meat in the sort of medium red. This is total meat in the dark red, and this is processed meat in the pink. And these are the main meta-analyses we have. Do you know what a meta-analysis is? So meta-analyses is when you look at the results of all kinds of studies and combine them so you can get an idea of what, the weight of evidence shows us. And so what you can see here is processed meat increasing a risk of mortality 44%, 20, 23, 22, 15, and essentially none of them show a risk reduction. All of them show increased risk, consistently, time and time again. Here are the meta-analyses on meat and heart disease. Same story, and I'm terribly sorry. I should have kept the unprocessed meat in the dark red and the processed in the light, but I reversed it this time. So you can see again, here's meat and diabetes. Look at this. Like 48%, 48%, 51%, 51%, and again, processed again is in the pink here. It's really quite shocking. Here's unprocessed meat and cancer, and consistent for every type of cancer you can imagine. It's associated with increased risk. Colorectal cancer being, really especially notable. Here's processed meat and cancer, even more significant findings. And there was a study done in 2014 looking at high protein diets and mortality. Over 6,000 participants, people eating more than 20% of calories from protein, who were 50 to 65 years of age, had a 74% increase in mortality. Cancer deaths were increased 433%. Diabetes risk was increased 393%. And the associations were abolished or greatly attenuated when they were getting their protein from plants, but not when they were getting their protein from animal products. Another study from Harvard, and this one, over 130,000 participants followed for about 30 years. And replacing only 3% of calories from animal protein with plant protein reduced risk of death by 34%. When you replace processed meat with plant protein, only 3% of calories. For eggs, it was 19%. For unprocessed meat, it was 12%. For dairy, it was 8%. And for poultry or fish, it was 6%. So again, replacing any animal product with plant protein provides a tremendous health benefit. And in 2015, the World Health Organization, the weight of the evidence became so strong that the World Health Organization actually declared processed meat a group 1 human carcinogen, and red meat a group 2A or probable human carcinogen. So this is so interesting because if you look here, other things in group 1 are cigarettes, alcohol, asbestos, and arsenic. So we put processed meats in the same category, and we still have cancer societies selling hot dogs to raise money for cancer. You go, what is wrong with this picture? It would be like selling cigarettes to raise money for lung cancer. It's absolutely insane. And so we need to be aware of this stuff. So let's move on to iron. It's another nutrient that I think we need to be aware of some of the advantages of getting iron from plants as opposed to getting iron from animals. So how much do we need? Well, women need about 18 milligrams a day if they're still menstruating. Once they get above or postmenopausal, they only need 8. The Institute of Medicine actually recommends that vegetarians and vegans get 1.8 times more iron than non-vegetarians. And most of the experts actually think they need to change that recommendation. And the reason we think they need to change that recommendation is because the recommendation was based on one study. It was a test diet that made the inhibitors of iron absorption as high as they could possibly be, and the enhancers of iron absorption as low as they could possibly be. In other words, this was the worst case scenario, and they based their recommendations on that, which seems absolutely ridiculous. So a lot of people believe, and many experts believe, at most maybe 1.2, definitely not 1.8 times higher. If you look at actual intakes of iron, this is really surprising to a lot of people. So this is the Adventist Health Study 2, non-vegetarians at about 20 milligrams a day, lacto-ovo at about 22, and vegans at 22.2. Who has the highest intake of iron? Vegans. Then look at Epic Oxford, 2016, same story. This is the non-vegetarians, lacto-ovo vegetarians, and vegans, highest intake. And again in the diet quality study from Belgium, 17, 20, and 23. So vegans often we get more iron than people that do consume dairy, because dairy is not very high in iron. So almost everything vegans eat provides iron. So what about iron status? Well, hemoglobin and hematocrit, vegetarians actually don't have higher incidence of iron deficiency, anemia. Our levels, our hemoglobin and hematocrit are not much different than anyone else. However, iron stores are typically lower in people eating plant-based diets. So serum ferritin tends to be a little bit lower. The lower iron stores that are at the lower end of the normal range, don't affect how a person feels and are not a disadvantage when your hemoglobin and hematocrit levels stay reasonable and you're getting reasonable sources of iron in your diet. And it may actually turn out to be an advantage. And it may turn out to be an advantage because both high ferritin and high levels of heme iron, which is blood, heme means blood, so this is iron in blood or iron in meat, are associated with insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, some cancers, and oxidative stress. Heme iron is a pro-oxidant. High levels of serum ferritin tend to be a disadvantage overall. So if we look at heme iron, well, heme iron is found in animal tissue, meat, poultry, and fish. About 40 to 45% of the iron in meat is heme, but there are traces in other foods. It's rapidly absorbed regardless of what your iron status is. It's just rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream. And as I mentioned, it can act as a pro-oxidant. And its impact has actually been quantified. And what we know is that for every 1 milligram of heme iron consumed per day, that's a tiny amount, 1 milligram, disease risk increases by an estimated 27 to 57% for heart disease, 16% for diabetes, and 12% for colon or lung cancer. So these are a number of studies have reported and quantified the effect of just small amounts of heme iron. The average American consuming, a reasonable amount of meat might be getting 5 or 6 milligrams of heme iron in their diet. So this is very significant. Non-heme iron, on the other hand, is absorbed and released in a controlled manner as the body needs it. It protects us against iron overload and oxidative stress, and it's not associated with increased disease risk at all. And in fact, it's so interesting, you actually absorb the type of iron in beans. You absorb this molecule with thousands of atoms of iron very slowly into the bloodstream, and the iron atoms are released one at a time as you need them. So it's much more controlled. So how do we maximize iron status? Because some vegetarians and some vegans do have challenges with keeping iron levels where they want them to be. So you want to begin by selecting iron-rich foods from within each food group. You want to moderate your intake of the things that we know impair iron absorption. You want to boost your intake of iron absorption enhancers, and you want to replace meat with legumes when you go plant-based rather than with dairy. And so the iron-rich foods from within each group will the most concentrated iron, or the beans most concentrated in iron are soybeans, tofu, lentils, and chickpeas, black beans as well. Whole grains, mainly pseudograins like amaranth and quinoa. All seeds are iron rich. Pumpkin seeds are a really good source. Cashews, pine nuts, almonds, and Brazil nuts are good sources. In the vegetable kingdom, the peas, the string beans, and the leafy greens. Fruits, well, mainly dried fruits and prune juice. And then fortified meat analogs or blackstrap molasses are also sources. Blackstrap molasses are really probably the only concentrated sweetener that provides a very significant amount of nutrients. So 2 tablespoons of blackstrap molasses has more iron than an 8-ounce steak and more calcium than a cup of milk. So it's really quite a concentrated source of some minerals. So number 2 is to moderate the intake of iron absorption inhibitors. And those are mainly phytates, polyphenolic compounds, zinc from single nutrient supplements, and calcium and dairy products. All inhibit iron absorption. And phytates can actually reduce iron absorption by up to 90%. This can be partly counteracted with vitamin C-rich foods, but it's something to be aware of. Wheat bran is the most concentrated source of phytates. So one thing you do not want to do, because phytates inhibit zinc absorption as well, you do not want to be sprinkling bran on your food. You remember when people used to sprinkle bran on everything? An omnivore who's eating a very low fiber diet, that could be a reasonable thing for them to do, but a vegan, you definitely do not want to be doing that. And I've actually had several people where I've gotten them off of this habit of sprinkling wheat bran on everything, and their health has improved dramatically because now they can actually absorb nutrients. So you need to be really careful of that. What you want is whole foods. You want to be eating whole grains, but you don't want to be taking the concentrated phytates out of the grain and piling them on everything you're eating. So that's just something to be aware of. We can reduce phytates in foods by leavening breads, for example, by sprouting, by fermenting, by soaking, by roasting. All of these different food preparation techniques can actually help to reduce the phytates in food. And I should also say that phytates aren't all bad. As a matter of fact, phytates are antioxidants. They provide a number of health advantages. You do not want to get phytates completely out of the diet because they're actually quite protective. You just don't want them overexpressed in the diet. You don't want to be putting massive amounts on your food. Polyphenolic compounds like tannins in tea can also reduce iron absorption from a meal by 50 to 90%. So having a cup of tea with your dinner could dramatically reduce your iron absorption from that meal, especially if it's black tea or green tea, but even some herbal teas can reduce iron absorption. And so there are lesser amounts in coffee and herbal teas such as peppermint and chamomile tea, cocoa, and wine as well. So if you're drinking these beverages, what you want to do is drink them at least an hour before or after meals, as opposed to drinking them with the meal. And vitamin C and organic acids can again help compensate for these compounds. Number 3, you want to boost your absorption of iron enhancers, which number 1 being vitamin C and organic acids. You can actually enhance the absorption of iron 2 to 6 times by having something rich in vitamin C with your meal. So what foods are rich in vitamin C? Peppers and citrus fruits and all sorts of fruits and vegetables. Those are primary sources. Allium vegetables like onion and garlic can help to enhance iron absorption. Beta-carotene rich foods like carrots and sweet potatoes can enhance iron absorption. And spices like pepper and turmeric and ginger can also enhance iron absorption. And finally, you want to replace meat with legumes rather than with dairy. So basically why? Well, dairy is low in iron, meat is high in iron, and dairy inhibits iron absorption, so it's like a double whammy. And so what do a lot of people do when they become vegetarian? Instead of meat and potatoes, it's lasagna and grilled cheese sandwiches and pasta with Alfredo sauce, all of those dairy foods, because they're comfort foods and people are familiar with them, they know how to cook them, as opposed to, lentils and tofu, which they didn't grow up eating. So this is something to be very much aware of. We want to be choosing legumes. Legumes provide a form of iron that is absorbed as we need it without being a pro-oxidant, and this is really our ideal source of iron. I want to talk a little bit about zinc as well, because it's not a nutrient we talk about very often, but basically zinc is necessary for the generation of life itself, and its main functions are cell division, building of proteins and DNA, growth and reproduction, the functioning of our immune systems, wound healing, acid-base balance, and taste, which sometimes when people lose their sense of taste, it can actually be a zinc deficiency. So how much do we need? Well, about 8 milligrams for men and about 8 for women. And there's no separate recommendation for vegetarians as there is with iron. However, our needs could be as much as 50% higher, especially if you eat a lot of phytates, so a lot of wheat bran. And we actually have homeostatic mechanisms that help people adjust to, in terms of both iron and zinc, to adjust to lower intakes. So your body actually gets better at absorbing it. In fact, with iron, it can be a 10-fold difference in your absorption when your body needs more. It's quite amazing. And when we look at the zinc intakes and status of vegetarians, we don't have a lot of information on this, but they're similar to or just slightly less than people who eat meat. And serum zinc levels are somewhat lower than non-vegetarian levels, but they're almost always within the normal range. And overt deficiency is not common among Western vegans and vegetarians. But what you need to know about zinc deficiency is it can impair immune function, it can cause a loss of appetite, it can cause hair loss and diarrhea. I know a lot of people who have gone on to some more extreme plant-based diets where they don't get enough protein, iron, or zinc, and they start losing their hair. And so it's something just to be aware of. Severe deficiency stunts growth in children quite significantly. So we see quite a loss of height in children. It delays sexual maturation. It can cause impotence and eye and skin lesions. So what factors increase risk? Well, inadequate zinc intakes and poor zinc absorption. And people who don't get enough in their diet there are two main reasons. People consuming too little calories, so people with eating disorders or poor appetite or who are sick. And then those consuming very few zinc-rich foods, too many refined foods, or very limited variety. And so we see, one of the things that we see commonly when people become vegetarian is they go from eating meat and potatoes to eating pasta and bagels. And this is not a good plan. As a matter of fact, if we look at the research, when you shift from a meat and potatoes to a pasta and bagel type diet, you're at no advantage whatsoever. It does not do you any good. As a matter of fact, replacing saturated fat with refined carbohydrates, it's a wash. They're both equally as bad. So we really need to be aware of that. So children who are picky eaters, junk food eaters, tea and toast seniors, older babies who are exclusively breastfed and aren't getting solid foods soon enough, and alcoholics. So just to be aware of that. And then poor zinc absorption can be the result of a high phytate diet. So in some cultures we see an emphasis on unleavened breads, and wheat bran, but especially in cultures where we see a lot of unleavened breads, we see more stunted growth in children because, especially if their dietary staples in the diet is suboptimal. Failure to employ techniques that reduce phytates, like the soaking, sprouting, fermenting, and leavening. And we also see it with people who have a reduced absorption ability. So people with GI disorders like Crohn's disease or colitis, those with malabsorption syndromes, liver disease, renal disease, diabetes, or cancer. And so just to give you a quick overview, here's what you get from legumes. And this is just a half cup serving size, with the exception of the soy milk. But you can see, 1 to over 2 milligrams of zinc in a serving, in a half cup. So you could double that for a full cup. So that's a really significant amount of zinc. Remembering that women only need 8 milligrams a day and men about 11. Seeds, a quarter cup of pumpkin seeds, 2.6. A quarter cup of chia seeds, 2. Just 2 tablespoons of tahini, 1.4. And then the nuts, cashews being at the top of the list, and then Brazil nuts and almonds. But even a cup of oatmeal, 2.4. I think that's really impressive. So a lot of zinc from oatmeal. A half a cup of kamut berries, 1.6. So a full cup would be 3.2. So really very significant amounts. And then some vegetables are reasonable sources of zinc as well. So what about plant versus animal sources again? And just bringing you back to this, one of the things that we need to think about and remind people of, when you think about the components in foods that are the most protective against disease, like fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and pre and probiotics and plant sterols and stanols, they're high in plant foods. They're low to nothing in meat and poultry. The things that are damaging to health, like the total unsaturated fat and the cholesterol and heme iron and new 5-GC and chemical contaminants and endotoxins and all of these things that are damaging. They're zero or low or very low in plant foods, whereas they're high or moderate, at the very least, in animal products. So we really need to think about that. We know about the components in foods that are protective versus components that aren't so great. I want to talk a little bit more about omega-3 fatty acids as well. We talked about them a little bit yesterday. There are basically 2 families of polyunsaturated fats that contain essential fatty acids: the omega-6 family and the omega-3 family. And they can't be interchanged. We have to get omega-6s and we have to get omega-3s. They're both essential, without which we would die. They have to be present in the diet. So each family includes 1 essential fatty acid or parent fatty acid. In the omega-6 family, that's linoleic acid. We abbreviate that as LA. And in the omega-6 family, it's alpha-linolenic acid. And we abbreviate that as ALA. And each family also provides several long-chain fatty acids. So in the omega-6 family, you have something called GLA or gamma-linolenic acid, dihomogamma-linolenic acid, and arachidonic acid. And in the omega-3 family, you have eicosapentaenoic acid or EPA and docosahexaenoic acid or DHA. And so the conversion to long-chain fatty acids can be fairly slow. But from LA and ALA, our body can actually build those long-chain fatty acids. And they're very important for structure and function of the body. But those long-chain fatty acids are actually not considered essential. We sometimes call them conditionally essential. And that means that in some situations where people can't convert, they become essential because they're necessary for our brains and our eyes and for our cell membranes. And if our bodies can't convert them, then we need them directly. So I apologize ahead of time for showing you this, but I just want to make a couple of points here. So this is the omega-6 family. This is the omega-3 family. And what happens during that, what happens during all of these steps to make these bigger, longer chain fatty acids is we start out by desaturating Desaturating means another point of unsaturation in the molecule. So we start here, alpha-linolenic acid, 18 carbons, 3 double bonds. We desaturate it to stearidonic acid, 18 carbons, and now 4 double bonds. We've got another point of unsaturation. And then elongase, so we make it bigger and longer. So we end up with this 20 carbons. And so on down the list of desaturating and making bigger and more unsaturated. And at the bottom, DHA is the biggest, most unsaturated fat in the diet. It's also very unstable because the more points of unsaturation, the less stable the molecule, which means it can go rancid quickly. And if you put it to heat, it will get oxidized very quickly. So as we go down this list, now what I want to show you here is that there are a couple of points here. So for example, right here, this DGLA, this goes to forming this series 1 anti-inflammatory eicosanoids, prostaglandins and prostacyclins and leukotrienes and thromboxanes and all of these chemicals that control different body systems. And then we have series 2 and 4 here with arachidonic acid, and this is in more inflammatory types of eicosanoids. And then over here with EPA, we've got the series 3 that are anti-inflammatory. And then with EPA and DHA, we've got these things called resolvins and protectins, and they are basically anti-inflammatory. And the omega-6 arachidonic acid increases platelet aggregation, increases cell division, decreases blood flow, suppresses immune function, as compared to the omega-3s, which decrease the stickiness. Platelet aggregation is the stickiness of your blood cells, decrease cell division, increase blood flow, enhance immune function. So what we see is a more sort of beneficial effects from the EPA as opposed to the arachidonic acid, though we need both. It's not like one is completely evil and the other has a halo. We actually need a balance of both. The problem is we don't get the balance that we need usually. And the protectins and resolvins from DHA and some from EPA are very potent anti-inflammatory agents. So these can be very good things. If you think about the sources of polyunsaturated fat, the omega-6 and omega-3, well, seeds, the chia, flax, hemp, canola are all omega-3, whereas all the other seeds are mainly omega-6. Grains are mainly omega-6. Greens are mainly omega-3. And animal products, well, EPA and DHA, breast milk, fish, eggs, and arachidonic acid, meat and dairy. So the omega-6 arachidonic acid, meat and dairy, pro-inflammatory. So the deal here is, early humans consumed an estimated, Paleolithic humans, 2 to 1 to 4 to 1 in favor of omega-6 to omega-3. And these two fatty acids actually compete for the conversion enzymes. So if you get a ton of omega-6, omega-3 might not be able to do the conversions. Both families are essential, but a lot of people consume 10 to 20 times more omega-6 than omega-3, and that's not a good thing. We need to bring that ratio back in order. People that are eating a lower fat diet, then just including some flax and chia and hemp usually brings them into reasonable balance. People who are eating a high fat diet with a lot of different oils, especially grapeseed and soybean and all of these omega-6 rich oils, they're the ones that have problems with the balance. They need to cut out the omega-6 oils, and they need to be including more of the omega-3 rich foods in their diet. So the imbalance can actually increase our risk of chronic diseases, can increase our risk of neurological disorders, autoimmune inflammatory disorders, and can contribute to suboptimal infant development as well. So the optimal balance is probably around, we could say 1 to 1 to 2 to 1, but that's really hard to achieve. Most experts and a number of studies have shown you can achieve a really good health with a balance of 2 to 1 to 4 to 1. And you can generate sufficient long-chain fatty acids if you're relatively healthy at that level. So the ratio is actually not really important for people consuming direct sources of EPA and DHA. So if you're taking EPA and DHA as microalgae, then certainly you wouldn't have to worry about it much. Or if you were eating fish, you wouldn't have to worry about that ratio as much as people who are not. So how can we optimize omega-3s? Well, we talked about this yesterday, so I'm going to just zip through it. You want to be aware of the factors that depress conversion. So basically, you can't do anything about your genetics or your gender. You certainly can do something about smoking. You can't do anything about your age. You can do something about chronic diseases. So you want to be making the best choices you can possibly make. Dietary factors, you don't want to be eating a lot of omega-6s. Omega-6s reduce conversion of omega-3s by 40 to 50%. Inadequate nutrition, so you need sufficient protein. You need enough zinc and magnesium and niacin and pyridoxine and vitamin C. You need to minimize intake of trans fatty acids and alcohol. And you should not be eating a diet that contains, very high levels of fat. Diets containing 40% or so of calories from fat depress conversion. So you want about 2 to 4 grams of, sorry, I should have not switched it so fast, but for people who don't eat fish, you want 2 to 4 grams a day of ALA. And in some cases, you may want direct sources as well of the long-chain fatty acids. So here we've got, if you look at these different foods, flaxseed is basically about 57% omega-3. Chia seed is about 63%. Hemp seed is around 20. Walnuts are around 14. Greens are close to 60. So you can see most of the fats in these foods are omega-3s. And so what would you need to get enough? You would need 1 to 2 tablespoons of flax, a couple tablespoons of chia seed, a couple tablespoons of hemp seeds, or probably more like a 1/4 cup of hemp seeds, and about 20 or 30 cups of greens. So you have to eat like a horse or a cow to get enough from greens. And you want to reduce omega-6 fatty acids. Avoid omega-6 rich oils. You can still eat omega-6 rich whole foods, but be cautious of the oils. And finally, you want to consider a direct source of long-chain omega-3s, especially if you have diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. The long-chain omega-3s may actually be an advantage. So who needs it? Well, I would suggest pregnant and breastfeeding women, even though they're the best converters of all, it's not a bad idea to make sure that your status is really good when you're growing a baby. And those who don't convert efficiently, people with, as I mentioned, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, populations who traditionally consume very high fish diets. They may not be able to convert very well because they never had to have, their body never had to make the desaturase enzymes because they were always getting direct sources. So once they stop getting direct sources, they may not be able to convert very well. And there are lots of these supplements widely available. So, I want to talk just very briefly about the advantages of choosing plant-based options. Well, the plant-based microalgae is clean, sustainable, and cruelty-free. And as you saw in this picture, it's actually really widely available. So all we're doing is growing the algae that makes the DHA and EPA. And yesterday I talked about it, but I'll just say it again for those that weren't here. Fish do not make EPA and DHA. It's made by little plants in the ocean. And these little plants in the ocean produce EPA and DHA, and we can culture them and produce it ourselves. So that's what we do, and that's what's in many of these supplements. And there are many, so just so you recognize, fish has probably an even bigger halo than a lot of other animal products. People think fish is the most healthy animal product you can consume. But what a lot of people don't realize is fish is our #1 source of heavy metals, mercury, lead, and cadmium. It is also the #1 source of several dietary contaminants, including dioxins. But it is an important source of PCBs, DDT, malachite green, antibiotics, antiseptics. So these are things just to be aware of. There are huge concerns about depletion of fish stocks as well. And in fact, there was a report that came out, I forget when it was, probably about 15 years ago, that suggested that by 2048, the fish stocks on the planet would basically be pretty much depleted. So we don't have, we can't be raping the oceans the way we are right now for very long. And there are huge ethical concerns as well. I can remember my husband and daughter once watching a show that was all about the wonderful life of various creatures living in the ocean. And the show went on, and at the end of the show, in the last 5 minutes or something, a big ship came along with about a mile-long net and swept up everything at the bottom of the ocean floor, brought everything in its path up to the ship, picked off the shrimp, and threw everything back dead to the bottom of the ocean floor, which was 80% of their catch. 80% of the catch for shrimp is bycatch. The turtles, the dolphins, the fish, all back to the bottom of the ocean dead to catch those shrimp. So it's really quite concerning. And then I just very briefly want to talk about calcium as well. And we talked about calcium yesterday, so I'm going to zip through the first part of this presentation and just a little review. So a lot of people believe that cow's milk is necessary for strong bones. And the reality is it is no more necessary than moose milk, deer milk, cat milk, dog milk, or any other milk of any other mammal. Every species produces a milk that is designed for the offspring of that species, perfectly designed for them. And when one mammal consumes the milk of another, things go wrong. It's just not meant to be, in my view. And moose milk, I jokingly say, has about 600 milligrams of calcium per cup as compared to 300 for cow's milk, and it doesn't make it an essential food. In pre-agricultural populations, humans averaged 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of calcium per day without a single drop of cow's milk. And they got most of it from plants. The recommended dietary allowance for calcium is 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams a day. We can quite easily get that from plants if we're making good choices. So we need to be consuming lots of greens and beans, and some nuts and seeds are reasonable sources like tahini and almonds, but a number of beans, tofu can be an excellent source, especially if it's precipitated with calcium sulfate. And then of course some of the fortified foods like the non-dairy beverages. This just gives you an idea of how much calcium is in various foods. And there's cow's milk at 300 milligrams. Here's blackstrap molasses, 2 tablespoons at 400. Roasted hemp seeds at 347 for a quarter cup. And then we've got a number of foods that are between 1 and 200 milligrams, like kale and tahini and navy beans. And then a variety of foods that are between 50 and 100 milligrams per serving. Even butternut squash, which is quite surprising, but figs, oranges, and so on. This is a menu just to show you how easy it is to get there. This menu provides between 1,250 and 1,600 milligrams of calcium. And so all we've got is oatmeal with blueberries and some fortified non-dairy milk, a few almonds on top, a pita with hummus and a kale salad and an orange, and a stir fry with tofu and Chinese greens, some brown rice, and a few apple slices. And we're well over the recommended intake. And here's the vegan plate or the plant-based plate from my books. which provides the sort of guidelines for calcium-rich foods as well. So, and then a lot of people wonder, can we actually absorb calcium from plants? We actually absorb about 32% of the calcium from dairy products, about the same from tofu and fortified soy milk, a little less from the fortified soy milk. We absorb just a little less from legumes and sweet potatoes. We absorb the most calcium from low oxalate greens. So broccoli, Chinese greens, kale, mustard greens, turnip greens, we absorb about 40 to 70% of the calcium. That's about twice as much as what we would absorb from cow's milk. And we absorb very little, about 5%, from beet greens, spinach, and Swiss chard. So although those are good, healthy greens, they're not great sources of calcium. So what about plant versus animal sources? Well, the nutritional pluses of plants, they're low in saturated fat, they're cholesterol-free, they're rich sources of all the good things that we've talked about, including a number of nutrients that are really important for bone health, like vitamin C, vitamin K, folate, magnesium, potassium, and boron. And I want to talk a little bit about milk from mammals. And you know, we know that cultures around the world have included, including our long-lived populations, like some of the blue zones do include dairy products and milk, or milk from, you know, goats or whatever it is, and they do all right. But that doesn't mean that dairy is necessary or that it's without risk. And there are many downsides to dairy: the saturated fat, the hormones, antibiotics, IGF-1, environmental residues, and other health risks. And I want to just go through them very, very quickly. Cheese is the #1 source of saturated fat in the US diet. And by replacing 5% of calories from dairy fat with equal calories from polyunsaturated fat, we see about a 24% risk reduction in cardiovascular disease. If we think about hormones, cow's milk contains natural hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and in some countries, such as the United States, synthetic hormones can actually be given to increase milk production further. Drinking cow's milk, we know, we have several studies showing this, actually increases estradiol and progesterone in the blood and urine of consumers, which has a negative impact. Antibiotics, the use of antibiotics to prevent infection and promote growth in these animals is very widespread. The use of antibiotics in animals without disease is associated with the growth of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And of course, we know that these bacteria enter the environment through manure and can infect people who are highly resistant, who become highly resistant to conventional treatment. IGF-1, are you familiar with IGF-1, insulin growth factor 1? This is a hormone that promotes growth, and it's very important during the growing years. We need it. But high levels of IGF-1 increase the risk of several cancers, including, and the growth of cancer cells. And there's a very strong link between animal product consumption, especially milk and dairy products, and serum IGF-1 levels. Reducing intake of dairy reduces IGF-1. If we think about environmental residues like POPs, POPs are persistent organic pollutants that move up the food chain. Dioxins and PCBs are two that we commonly think of. These accumulate in the fat of animals. They disrupt hormones, increase cancer risk, damage the nervous system, and increase food sensitivities. And then we have heavy metals that damage the central nervous system and increase cancer risk. They're more concentrated in conventional than organic milk, but nonetheless, they're in all of these products. And when we think about health risks, well, probably about 70% of the world's population is lactose intolerant. We know that dairy increases prostate cancer risk, acne, and may be associated with increased risk of type 1 diabetes. So lactose intolerance, as I mentioned, 70% of the world's populations. The rates are lowest in Northern Europe, but highest in Asia, Africa, and South America. Lactose intolerance generally results in all sorts of GI issues: stomach upset, bloating, cramps, diarrhea. Prostate cancer, dairy is linked to increased risk of prostate cancer. A 2018 study showed that whole milk increased risk of prostate cancer recurrence in overweight men. And a 2017 study showed that men who consumed 3 or more servings of high-fat milk a day had a 6 times higher risk of death from prostate cancer than men consuming less than 1 serving a day. Acne, there is a very positive link between milk intake, especially skim milk, and acne. There's also a link between milk and the severity of acne. Type 1 diabetes, there's a link between this A1 beta-casein protein in milk and type 1 diabetes. And early evidence suggests that high fiber diets protect against type 1 diabetes. And not all cows make the same amount of this type of protein. So there are some areas where the cows may, produce a lot more of this type of protein. And we actually see much higher levels of type 1 diabetes in these populations. I love the words of wisdom from Michael Clapper where cow's milk is concerned. He said the purpose of cow's milk is to turn a 65-pound calf into a 400-pound cow as rapidly as possible. Cow's milk is baby calf growth fluid. Everything in that white liquid, the hormones, the fat, the protein, the growth factors, the IGF-1, every one of those is meant to blow that cow up to a great big cow or it wouldn't be there. And he is a very wise man, as we all know. And I want to leave you with a few more thoughts before we take some questions. Plant-based diets have benefits for ourselves, but they also have benefits beyond ourselves. And I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes talking about that. There is no greater step that any one individual can take towards the preservation of this planet than adopting a plant-based diet. I can remember when I wanted to go plant-based about 30 years ago, and I lived in Northern Ontario. And I had only ever met one real live vegetarian in my whole life. And I was a little nervous. I had 2 small children. And my husband grew up in Northern Ontario. This is hunting, fishing country, big time. He grew up doing all of those things. And I wasn't sure how he was going to respond. And I asked him if he would be willing to become a vegetarian with me. And he looked at me and smiled, and he said, "I thought you'd never ask." He said, "I'd love to be a vegetarian because I can't think," he said, "one of the things that's most important to me is to leave a soft footprint on this planet. And I can't think of a better way of doing that." And I thought, boy, did I pick well. Thanks. The United Nations Environmental Program expert panel concluded that 2 activities have a disproportionately large effect on the planet's life support systems: animal agriculture, especially raising livestock for meat and dairy, and fossil fuels. Their recommendation? A global shift to a plant-based diet. That's the United Nations. The proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences put out a study in 2016 that said by 2015, greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced by 29% if everybody followed the World Health Organization guidelines to eat more fruits and vegetables, eat less meat, sugar, and calories. But they would be reduced by 70% if everybody went vegan. Their recommendation, a global shift to a plant-based diet. In 2019, the Lancet Commission summary report on food, planet, health. This is what Walter Willits had to say. He was part of this report. Global consumption of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes will have to double. Consumption of foods such as red meat and sugar will have to be reduced by more than 50%. A diet rich in plant-based foods with fewer animal sources confers both improved health and environmental benefits. So we're really starting to see this. When we think about benefits for people, well, the human health impacts, that same study from the National Academy of Sciences said by 2050, deaths would be reduced by 5.1 million people if the global dietary guidelines, like the World Health Organization guidelines, were followed, and by 8.1 million people if everybody went vegan. More than half of the deaths would be, more than half of avoided deaths would be due to decreases in red meat consumption. When we think about human hunger, there was a study that came out that said if everyone ate a plant-based diet, the global calorie supply would be increased by an estimated 50%, which could effectively wipe out hunger. And other animals. And I want to leave you with this. I love that. Eat more kale. Smart chickens. Yeah. You know, we slaughter 70 billion land animals every year for food. That's like 10 times the human population, or thereabouts. The vast majority, probably about 90%, are raised in CAFOs. CAFOs are confined animal feeding operations. And you know what shocks me when I think about it, and I just can't help but thinking, here, you've got pigs who have the intelligence of a 3 to 5 year old child. They can learn to play games on computers. And I thought it was really interesting at the University of California, Berkeley, they showed that pigs, they would use a snout, do a joystick where they would have to match things up, and the researchers said there was no pig that ever made a mistake, ever. They just got it right every time. She said it took her way longer to teach chimpanzees to do it than pigs. Dogs couldn't do it at all. They weren't capable. And yet somehow it's okay to take an animal that would live 12 to 15 years, put them in their little cages in a facility where they live 6 months, fatten them up as much as possible, torture them that whole time, and then send them to slaughter where 10 to 30% of them are inadequately stunned and skinned and boiled alive. If we did that to a dog, we'd go to jail. But because pigs are considered food, they don't get the same protection. Albert Schweitzer once said that the time is coming when people will be amazed that the human race existed so long before it recognized that thoughtless injury to life is incompatible with real ethics. Ethics, in its unqualified form, is extended responsibility to everything that has life. He was another very wise man. Albert Einstein said we have to do the best we can. It is our sacred human responsibility. We have a choice. When we consider the consequences, not just for ourselves, but beyond ourselves, a plant-based diet becomes an ecological and ethical imperative. And I believe the day is coming when we won't have a choice. We're the leaders, starting this when we're starting it. But there will come a day when the human race will not have a choice. But we need to get there sooner than later if we want to have a future for our children and grandchildren. And with that, I will say thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening. We have only 4 minutes. I'm so sorry, but if anybody has a question or two, I'm very happy to take your questions. Yes, there's a question right here.
And remember, be strong.